Hi, my name's Jo Morgan. I'm a maths teacher and I write the blog resourceaholic.com. Today I'm presenting to you a workshop called Countdown to GCSE. This is aimed at Year 11 maths teachers. Whether you're new to teaching Year 11 or you're an experienced teacher just looking for some new ideas, this presentation is all about revision and preparing your students for their summer exams. This presentation is split into 4 sections. The first is on post-specification lessons. So that's normal timetabled lessons with your Year 11 class that happen between you finishing teaching the scheme of work, so once you've taught all the content of the GCSE, until they leave for study leave or to take their final exams in the summer. The second section is about interventions. Then I talk a bit about independent work, so what we want our students doing at home. And then I talk about the May and June, so those very final lessons, the last time you see your students before the exam and what kind of thing you can be doing then. Now, the first section is about those post-spec lessons. And this is really important that we use this time really wisely, because we have 5 years of maths teaching from the beginning of Year 7 up until around Easter of Year 11, and in all that time we are teaching new content, constantly doing retrieval work, so constantly helping our students to remember the things they've learnt before. But along the way there's all this new stuff that they need to learn, and then suddenly we come to the end of that where we've ticked all the boxes, we have taught all that GCSE content, and then they might have say 2 months left until they actually sit their final exams, not just in maths but in all the subjects they're sitting exams in. So they've got this big exam period coming up and we have to use that time really well. This is something I have changed a lot over the course of my career. So definitely at the start of my career I didn't do a good job during this period. There were things that I did wrong that I will talk about in this presentation, and over the years teaching Year 11 for 10 years has given me lots and lots of experience and ideas of what I can do during that period to make sure that time is used as effectively as I can. Now, back in January 2019, I did a poll on Twitter. Quite a lot of teachers responded to this, so I think it gives us a fairly good idea of the hours of teaching that we get for Year 11 in this country. So 1,442 responses, and 45% of those responses said that they get 3.5 to 4 hours a week with their Year 11 class. So let's say that we think the average is about 4 hours per week. That might give you an idea of whether your school gets a similar amount to others. And then let's say that we finish teaching the spec at the beginning of March. Well, then we've got the whole of March, the whole of April, and most of May left to do some revision. However, we've got Easter holidays in that time, so we can take that out. We have bank holidays. We have students going off timetable for all sorts of things in Year 11, like for example, students might go off and take art exams. So the first thing I do when I finish teaching the spec is I get a calendar and I figure out exactly when I'm going to see my Year 11s. And I make a plan for that time. And for me, that plan is quite specific and it's quite carefully made up front. I might may have a totally different plan if I have 2 different Year 11 classes, because it depends very much on the profile of that class, their strengths, their weaknesses, the topics that I think they haven't seen in a while, the topics that I know that I didn't maybe teach as well as I could the first time. Maybe there were topics that I'd rushed in the course of the year that I need to come back to. All sorts of things will feed into how that plan looks. Now, I have made mistakes in the past for this period of time, this sort of a couple of months between finishing teaching the spec and starting the exam period. And let me talk you through each of these mistakes. And it's not to say that people doing these are doing something wrong, it's just that when I've done it in the past, it has been slightly disastrous for me. Now, students teaching the lessons. Now, if I go back to my NQT year, when I had a Year 11 class for the first time, and I was working in a grammar school at the time, and this was the old spec GCSE, which was way easier than new spec, and everyone used to finish with loads of time to spare. We used to finish at around February. So we'd have this very long period where we all used to get a bit bored as teachers because we'd taught all the spec, and to us this was just a very long revision period where we kind of didn't have anything particularly interesting to do with our classes. Well, this is what we thought at the time. And in my NQT year, I was advised by my colleagues that I could sort of sit back and have a cup of tea while my students taught the lessons. They said this is really great for their revision, and they really enjoy it, and it fills the time nicely. Now, the first year I did this, I sat there watching my students teach the lessons. So they got into groups, I gave them the topics to teach, and I was really disappointed with the type of lessons that I was seeing. They were lessons where there was no challenge, there were no misconceptions being addressed, there was no one was learning anything. And of course, what did I expect? I mean, obviously, why on earth would I think that that this was, particularly without any particular direction from me, why did I think these students would put a good level of challenge, and why did I think that they would address misconceptions? And there was no reason for them to do that. To them, this was a really enjoyable activity. They engaged in it well. The students enjoyed having their peers teach the lessons. But in terms of an effective use of time and in terms of them learning anything new or making any difference to the final outcomes, I would say that it was slightly disastrous. The next year, I asked the same question of my colleagues: what shall I do with that time after I finished teaching a spec? They all told me to teach the lessons, to get the students to teach the lessons. I said that didn't go well last year. It really felt like it was a bad use of time, and they told me I'd done it all wrong and that I should be providing my students with really clear guidance on what those taught lessons should look like. So I changed the way I did it. I gave my students lists of things that had to feature in the lessons. I told them exactly what I expected of them, and yes, the lessons were marginally better. But still, I was sitting at the back of the room not doing anything particularly useful. I was giving them some feedback on their lessons, but really, when I'm sitting there watching some students do a revision lesson on surds, and I'm thinking, oh, they haven't mentioned that thing that everyone keeps getting wrong, then I know that I'm not doing the best by my students, because I should be at the front of the class telling my students about that thing that everyone keeps getting wrong. I should be the person saying, you know what, I marked your mocks and I know that most people in this class made this mistake, so let's talk about that mistake and let's talk about how we're not going to make that mistake again. My students weren't able to do that because they hadn't marked the mocks. They weren't experienced maths teachers, so of course they couldn't do that. So this is something that after that second year of trying it, I got a lot more confident in my ability to say, actually, that's not what I want to do during that period. A better use of that time would be for me to really think carefully about how my students could make progress, because I firmly believe that during that period of time when my students taught the lessons, people in the class were not making progress, as enjoyable as it was. Now, there may be lots of teachers watching this who are thinking, oh, I've done this really well in the past, and that's great. When I did it, it didn't work, and it's not something I'll be doing again. I've also had years where I've done a whole load of really engaging, fun activities, relays, carousels, games to fill that period of time. Now, I've got nothing against a relay or a carousel, but I didn't need to gamify the whole thing. It wasn't necessary. Students respond well to learning new things and to getting better at things. That's engaging. And even though there are opportunities for students to consolidate their knowledge through relays, actually there's a lot wrong with this sort of games that are involved with students quickly answering questions and sort of racing each other, because the point is that if they find something they can't do, then they're actually not getting any better at that thing. So they're not, if they're finding that actually they have no idea how to solve this trigonometry problem, but they're in the middle of a relay, it might be that the person that they're in a pair with does it for them, or there's all sorts of things that could happen there, but it's unlikely that they're going to get any better at solving trigonometry problems in that scenario. So as much as I think that there are some lovely activities that are sort of gamey, I don't think that me doing that every single lesson for a couple of months was a good use of time. So I don't do that anymore. Another thing that I've done in the past is absolutely tons of past papers, and I mean almost every lesson for, say, a month. Past paper, past paper, past paper. Let's find every single exam paper we can find from any board, from any spec, from a long time ago, from, hey, we got something from another country, have we got something from a different qualification, we're just going to do anything that looks like an exam paper. And now that's overkill, that's too much, and I have done that before where I have been searching around for exam papers. I genuinely believe there's a lot of benefit in students doing lots of exam paper practice in the run-up to exams. However, I don't think that's a useful thing to do in every single lesson. I don't think it's a good use of the fact that there's a teacher in the room who could be doing some teaching. I do think that it's useful to go around and help students who are doing papers and talk to them individually about the questions they're stuck on. However, I think there are better uses of time when the teacher's in the room, and I'll talk to you about them now. Now, the key principles to revision or to consolidating topics is laid out in this diagram, and basically it's starting off with assessing. So that might have already been done, perhaps through me marking their mock exams or from some other way of assessment, maybe just the fact that I know my students well because I've taught them for a while. But first of all, I need to assess them in that I need to know what they can do and what they can't. Are there any areas that they are particularly weak on? Have they forgotten something? I remember the first time I taught year 11 and they were really smart. It was a grammar school, so they were all going to go and get A stars, and a lot of them couldn't remember how to do things like round to significant figures because they hadn't done it in years. And there were some sort of real basic things like, say, plans and elevations and constructions where they just didn't really remember it very well. And that's the sort of assessment. I did some assessment which pulled out those kind of little odd bits and pieces that I needed to revisit. So I need to do some kind of assessment. Using that assessment, we identify the topics that need to be revisited, and we might actually reteach those topics. Now, it won't be like teaching from scratch because we're not going through the concept right from the beginning and spending, say, 2-3 weeks teaching a concept in depth. But it might be one lesson of, right, we need to go through, let's say, constructions from the start. We're going to do this in one lesson, so it's going to be recap, but it will be a taught lesson. It will not just be asking them to practice something, because if they don't remember it, then asking them to practice is just not helpful. They actually need someone to stand up and re-explain it or remind them of how it works before they do the practice. So we've got the reteaching, and then we've got the practice, and then again we can assess and think, have they actually got this now? And then we've got this cycle going on. So we're finding topics that need some attention, reteaching, and then practicing, and not skipping the reteaching bit, because the thing that's not a good use of time is saying, well, you know what, I think that this class really struggle with index laws, so I'm going to give them a load of index laws to practice. They need someone to stand there and explain to them what the misconceptions are and what the rules are, and show them some examples. You can't skip the reteaching bit. So I think we need to make use of the expert in the room, as in we need to make use of the teacher. We can't have the teacher either sat redundant at the back of the room while the students lead the lessons, nor should we have the teacher just kind of wandering around and just kind of helping out here and there. When I say utilising the expert, I mean the teacher knows the common misconceptions. The teacher knows how to explain to the students what they should be doing, and therefore we need the teacher doing some of that during revision lessons or during those lessons that are after we finish teaching the spec. So a typical lesson for me after I've finished teaching the scheme of work would be a revision lesson where I choose a specific topic. I might spend the first 20 minutes of the lesson just doing some retrieval practice. Mixed topic, that might be, because that helps me with my assessment to figure out things I need to do in the subsequent lessons. I then might do 20 minutes of instruction, topic specific from me. So I might say, right, today I'm going to do a revision lesson on surds. I'm going to talk to you about the methods, the main misconceptions. I'm going to look at a few example exam questions. So that's the main teaching bit of the lesson. And then I might say, right, last 20 minutes of the lesson, we're all going to practice some exam questions or anything to do with this topic. So it's all topic specific. So I might do a lesson on surds. Then the next day I might do a lesson on changing the base for index laws, if this was, say, a class that we're aiming for grade 8 and 9. Or I might do a lesson on solving quadratics. So I am specifically picking out topics and doing this instruction and practice rather than just going straight into a period of mixed revision. I feel really strongly that there needs to be topic specific stuff during this post-spec time. The retrieval practice at the beginning, like I say, helps me to pick the topics for future lessons. So for example, my retrieval practice might be a Corbett Maths 5 a day, or it could be any similar mixed topic questions. So here, this is a higher and a higher plus example. There you can see that I might give that higher set of questions to my students at the beginning of the lesson. In fact, if I had a really strong class, I might give the higher with the higher plus on the back if I think that that's the right kind of number of questions for them. And let's just say that I'm going around the class while they're doing it, and loads of them are putting up their hand to ask me the first question there about the interior angles of an octagon. So they're all able to do lots of the work on the sheet, but I just noticed that lots and lots of hands went up for that first question. Now that might prompt me to say, right, I need to do a revision lesson on angles in polygons, and that might come maybe in a couple of days' time or next week. That will be a topic that I focus on. So I am responding to how they're getting on in these retrieval exercises, helping them individually while they're doing it, going through the answers with them all so that they all know how to do all of this, but importantly I'm picking out the things that were common problems. Now those Corbett Maths 5 a day exercises are really helpful for revision lessons. They have numeracy foundation plus higher and higher plus, so that's a really good range of levels that should be able to pretty much suit any student. Now I say they work best in revision lessons. I say that because I have tried to use them in normal teaching before as retrieval starters, and I find that they're not always ideal just because I can't control the topics that are on them. So I don't want students having to do retrieval on a topic that I've not taught them yet, or it might be that I might not want to give the questions in that particular order or something like that. So I now make my own retrieval starters, and I will give my students a set of questions from things they've learned recently and learnt last term, etc. However, when I get to the end of the spec, there should be nothing on these Corbett Maths 5 a days that my students haven't seen before. So the only time that these are exactly right for my students is at the end of year 11, where if there is something that none of them recognise, then I realise I really have to teach that. But at this point, they should have seen every single topic that comes up on these Corbett Maths 5 a day tasks. So these are really helpful, particularly for revision lessons. Now the teaching part of my revision lessons will just be, it won't be huge because I haven't got very long. It won't be teaching from scratch. I mean, here's an example of one of my lessons, very, very straightforward. I have a revision lesson on angles and polygons, and I have a question posed to the class: how do we find the interior angle in a regular nonagon? And then I'm showing two different methods for doing that, and I'm talking them through how those methods work. So in this case, it's the angles in the triangle. There are 7 triangles in the nonagon that each have 180 degrees in them, so it's that method. The other method is the exterior angle method. So I'm talking my students through the two methods, and then I'm showing them some example exam questions. So in this case, I went through 3 example exam questions. I talked to them about the use of the methods. I reminded them how it works. Remember, this is not teaching from scratch. This is a reminder of stuff they've learned in the past. That maybe is 15 minutes, 20 minutes possibly, taking some questions, having some class discussion, and then I can set them a pack of questions, preferably exam style questions because we're at this point a couple of months away from the exam, and I'm letting them have a go at those questions while I circulate around and help them. So remember, that mini lesson covers the methods and misconceptions and looks at some example questions, and that is something that I would do in all of those post-spec lessons where I'm focusing on a particular topic. So what I'm saying is there needs to be a teaching element of that lesson. Now, what might that worksheet look like at the end? Now, this worksheet here is on Pythagoras, but it's a good example of a mixed review worksheet where I'm saying, hey, we're going to practice this whole topic in 20 minutes. So it's not like the sort of initial teaching where I build up the skill over time, and over a series of lessons I do various different parts of the skill. In this case, I'm saying, right, we're going to do some mixed review. Now, Maths for Everyone is a brilliant website for mixed review resources. So if you look at this one, which is Pythagoras, it goes from finding lengths through to solving problems using Pythagoras. And it's all laid out really nicely. That is not a huge amount of photocopying. It's 1 sheet per student for a revision lesson. And this would be after I've gone through the main points of Pythagoras. So let's say that my class, I know they've forgotten Pythagoras. So I do my lesson where I start with some retrieval. At the middle of the lesson is me reminding them of how to do Pythagoras with a few examples, and then the final part of the lesson I'm giving them this sheet to work on while I go around and help them. Maths for Everyone resources are fantastic because they come, not only are they really well structured, really well thought out, but they come with really lovely solutions, so I can project that on the board and it's really clear. It talks through the methods and it's just a really, really nicely formatted resource, and really helpful throughout teaching in every year group. And there's lots, particularly these ones that say review at the top, which are particularly helpful for consolidation lessons for year 11. If you have a look at Maths for Everyone resources, and they're not just reviews. So if you look at this, they're at the top left of each sheet, it does say what the sheet's for. So there's strengthen, first steps, review, extend. Now these are things you'd use in your teaching, and I'm saying there that the review questions are particularly useful. But actually it depends, you know, you can pick the most suitable sheet for your class. They are fantastic resources and I really recommend having a look at them if you haven't seen them before. The other thing that I really like on Maths for Everyone, particularly for year 11 classes, is the exam style question packs. These are really, really helpful. They are taken from or based on past exam questions. They're really well formatted. They are a good size. They normally take quite a while to complete all the questions, and they are really well laid out. So this is an example of one on Pythagoras, and you can see that this has got some 3D Pythagoras questions in it. They have a good progression of questions, so it's a pack of exam questions that starts with the basics of the topic and leads on to some quite challenging questions. I think these are incredibly useful, and I again use them throughout from year 7 through to year 11, but they're particularly helpful for consolidating individual topics in year 11. Another source of practice questions for that last part of the revision lessons is Maths Genie, just because Maths Genie has collections of questions by topic. So for example, if I had a foundation class and I wanted to revise proportion, and I could take the proportion questions from Maths Genie and use them as the main activity in my lesson. They are just mixed exam questions, but they're ready to go, so this doesn't require a huge amount of work by the teacher, and this would be a good resource to use at this stage in the course. So there's my lesson, the lesson format that I use. I wrote a blog post called Structured Revision Lessons a few years ago that explains how I use this format, and this has now been something I've used for quite a few years now, where I've said that I've got rid of the student-led lessons, I've got rid of the games and carousels every day. I've got rid of the lesson after lesson after lesson of past paper practice, and I now do this structure for lessons for a good few weeks, the majority in fact of the time that I have between finishing the spec and the exam starting. You might be wondering then, when do I do the exam paper practice? Because I'm certainly not saying that we shouldn't have any mixed topic practice in there at all. Students will be doing exam papers at home, and we'll talk about that later, but I do think that in the process, the structure of the lessons that fall between finishing the spec and the exams happening, I do think there is a time and a place for some lessons which involve students doing exam papers. So let's say I have a 6-week period of revision lessons between finishing the spec and the exams. Then I might say I'm going to do 3 weeks where I focus on a different topic for every lesson. I've written some examples of topics down there, but it will totally depend on the class. These are topics that I have done in the last couple of years during that period of time. It totally depends on what you have noticed that your students need a bit of extra work on. Sometimes I find that a bit of stats is helpful there. So for example, cumulative frequency, something that they forget, bounds sometimes. maybe circle theorems, depending on when they did them in year 11. If they just did circle theorems at the end of the course, then I probably don't need to revise it straight away. But if they did circle theorems back in September of year 11, then that might be something I want to revise. However, maybe this is a class where circle theorems kind of isn't that important to them, because maybe they're working at a grade 4 or 5, in which case I might choose, say, shape transformations to revise. In fact, maybe they haven't done shape transformations since year 10. So I would pick the topics carefully there. Now, I'm saying maybe 3 weeks. This totally depends how long you've got. But 3 weeks really is just 12 topics if you're doing 4 lessons a week. So I'm going to pick 12 topics that I'm going to go through in some detail in a topic specific revision lesson. Then in the weeks that follow that, maybe for 2 weeks, I might do some mixed topic stuff. So that's where I might bring in my exam papers, and I'll do some stuff which covers lots of different topics in one go. So I'll move away a bit from the topic specific focus that I had in the first 3 weeks. In the say the final week, let's say I had 6 weeks and this comes to the final week before they all go off and start taking their exams. At that point I might go back to my topic focus, but then I bring all my non-calculator topics in. And the reason I'm doing that is their first paper is non-calculator, so this is the stuff that I want to focus on straight away before their paper, so that the most fresh thing in their mind are the things that are most likely to come up. So for example, I might do ratio, I might do multiplying and dividing decimals, they often forget how to do that. I might do standard form. Perhaps if I have a higher class, I'll do some surds, but some things that I think will definitely be on that first paper, I might save for that last week of teaching. Let's have a look now at some resources then. So I've talked about the structure of revision lessons, and I want to talk about some resources, including some resources that bring together lots of different topics. So resources that you might not have seen before, perhaps you've seen some of them, but some things that are useful to know about if you're a year 11 teacher. There are different types of resource available to year 11 teachers, and I'd say that some of them are more suitable for teaching, and I mean initial sequences of instruction. So the first time, for example, students see solving quadratics, you will use totally different resources to when you revise solving quadratics at the end of year 11. So we have teaching resources and we have review resources. So for example, bossmaths.com. I love Boss Maths, what a fantastic website. They have for every single topic lessons that involve a warm-up, examples, exercises, and explain the mistake. And then they'll have exam questions, they'll have challenge questions, they have all sorts of things for every single topic. Now I'd say that these resources are suitable for initial teaching because they take topics from the start and they teach them from scratch. So I wouldn't necessarily use this for revision lessons, but I would use it during the course of teaching year 11. Similarly, MathsPad, which is like one of my absolute favourite websites in the world. I'm using it all the time. I'm using it every day in my teaching at Key Stage 3 and 4. But I'd say that their resources are there for teaching topics from the beginning, so initial teaching rather than review. They do have resources available for revision, but I would describe these as teaching resources rather than review resources. And I'd say the same for lots of other websites that I make a lot of use of, like CIMT, Don Stewart, variationtheory.com, in fact particularly variationtheory.com. Those sequences of questions on that website are not designed necessarily for revision. They're for instruction, they're for teaching students concepts from scratch, and they are not for consolidation. So these are all resources I love, but they're not the resources I want to talk about in today's presentation because I'm talking about revision today. So here are some examples of resources that might help with consolidation. Same structure, different deep resources are a set of resources that the idea was from Craig Barton, and there's now a whole website, ssddproblems.com. And the wonderful thing about these problems are that the students have to figure out what topic to use or what method to use. And when we say method, we mean what part of maths do we need to use to solve these problems, because they all look the same. The idea here is that imagine if I gave students a worksheet and at the top it said Pythagoras, and every single question on that worksheet required Pythagoras to use it. At no point are they having to decide, oh, I need to use Pythagoras here. But when they get to their exam and they look at the questions, they'll have to decide what topic to use, what method they have to call on to answer that question. When we do it in lessons, they don't do that. in the exam, they do have to do that. So the way that Craig has tackled this is he came up with this idea of questions that look the same, but all use something different, so that students are being forced to figure out actually what is it I need to work out here and what bit of maths am I using to do that. In Craig's book, How I Wish I'd Taught Maths, he explains the idea like this. The correct solution to most mathematical problems involves 2 steps. Identify the strategy needed to solve the problem and then successfully carry out that strategy. So he's saying that we have 2 things we need to do. And the idea with an SSDD problem is that first of all, we are identifying the strategy and then we are carrying out strategy. So I'm thinking, oh, that one's Pythagoras, now I do Pythagoras. Whereas in our normal worksheets, we don't get the, oh, that one's Pythagoras moment, because the worksheet's all about Pythagoras. So we only get to execute the steps, we don't get to decide which steps they need to be. So this is a really great idea. It makes a lot of sense. If you go to ssddproblems.com, you'll find a whole load of mixed topic exercises just like that one. Craig says, exposing students to these batches of questions should help them to better develop the all-important ability to transfer their knowledge to different situations, which is a vital component of problem solving. So that idea of really understanding a topic by using it in all these different contexts is something we really need our students to develop. Here's another example of an SSDD problem. So this one we have the exact same surface structure, so everything looks the same in every picture, but they're all totally different topics. So the first one we're asking for an area. In the next one we want the coordinates of a midpoint. In the next one we want equations of lines. And then the next one we want some distances. So they're totally different parts of maths, and students have to figure out which bit of maths to use in each case. Another technique we can use in these consolidation lessons is goal-free problems. This is something that Craig wrote about in his book, and lots of teachers have created their own goal-free problems. They're actually pretty easy to make, and I'll show you why. This is an example of a Key Stage 2 problem from a SATs paper. Ali and Jack buy some stickers. We've got 12 stickers cost £10.49, or they're 99p each for stickers. And we're being asked how much more Jack pays than Ali, given that they buy the stickers in different ways. Now, a lot of children will look at that and be overwhelmed by the information. They will see all sorts of things happening. They won't know where to start. They won't know what calculations they are meant to be doing to solve the problem. By taking away the question, how much more does Jack pay than Ali, and making the question, what can you work out, a student can just get straight involved in it without sort of pausing to think, I don't know what it is they're asking me to do. What can you work out? Well, I could work out how much 12 stickers cost if they're 99p each. There's all sorts of things you can just launch into, and actually what you'll end up doing is answering the question that was intended. But the point is that it gives students that confidence to just get going, because they don't have that goal which gives them the overload. They don't have that goal which scares them off, and they just have some information that they can do some stuff with. So it gives them the opportunity to just have a go. Craig, in his book, says that this subtle, simple change means students can make more progress through problems, learning all the time, instead of being overwhelmed by a single goal that seems far away and unattainable. I found it makes students more willing to have a go at problems as they know they can make a start. So the idea here is that students who might struggle with maths or struggle to get going on problems will get the consolidation and the practice and all that stuff you want them doing, because they won't be scared off by the fact that they just don't know how to get to the final solution. So here's another example of a goal-free problem. They're very easy to make. It's just a GCSE question. You get rid of the actual question bit and you put in the words, what can you work out? So this one is a cylinder where we have the radius and the height provided. And if you ask what you can work out, now a student won't be scared off by a really complicated question, but they might say, well, I can work out the area of the top. I can work out the surface area, maybe I can work out the volume, and there's all these things they can have a go at. And that's all great practice for them. So that's all time well spent while they're doing those calculations. In Craig's book, he says that Oliver Lovell suggested we could encourage students themselves to turn any problem they are struggling with into a goal-free problem. So when faced with a complex multi-step maths problem, students could essentially just cover up the goal-specific question and just start working things out. So what he's suggesting is that we take any maths question, and if they're really struggling, they can just say, well, I'm going to ignore the question bit and I'm just going to work out a load of stuff. Now, if they've been practicing with goal-free problems, they'll be used to that. And then there'll be some stuff they write down, which is actually going to get them some marks. This is a similar idea. I saw this one years ago on the blog of Hannah, Miss Radders from Twitter, who wrote about an idea of providing a diagram from a GCSE question, but not providing the question itself. So she gives the students a diagram, and then she gets them to brainstorm what could the question actually be. So here you can see they've been given this shape and they've been given some dimensions, and they've written down examples like what percentage of the shape is shaded, what's the area of the shaded shape, what's the perimeter, find the value of x, all these kind of things that the question could be asking them to do. So they brainstorm what the question could be about. Then they've written all their ideas on the board. And they've gone through them and they've considered certain things together. So they've worked in pairs or teams to try and answer all the questions that the class came up with, and they have to think which ones are possible, which ones are impossible and why, and what information could be provided to make them possible. So for example, in this one, find x isn't possible unless, say, the area or perimeter is provided in the question, and then it would be possible to find x. And that's a really helpful discussion for students to be having. At the end of the lesson, Hannah said that she would tell the students what the actual original question was and get them to answer that one on their own at that point. So they've had this lesson where they've all worked together to explore this diagram, and they've had a go at answering all these different questions related to the diagram. And at the end, we're like, right, now we've had that discussion, and on our own, we're actually going to work out the answer to the actual question as it looked in the exam. Having a look at some other revision resources, we have Access Maths. If you go to that website, there's a whole load of stuff, really nice resources that can be used for students to do those consolidation lessons before their GCSE. Here's an example of one. This is progressive overload algebra. Basically, they get progressively more difficult as you go along, and there's simplification, expansion, factorising. This might be helpful, a helpful activity if you take on a new Year 11 class in Year 11 and you're not sure how their algebra is, because you might get an idea of how far along they can go on each row. It's also perhaps a helpful one to do some revision of basic algebra skills. So this actually works. I think this works with Foundation, which is pretty helpful because they can do things like, try and factorise some quadratics, and then if they can't do that, you can go through that on the board and remind them how to do it. You can check on their simplification, check on their expansion, double brackets, all that kind of thing. Some students will be horrified by this number of questions. Some students will love it. Students tend to like things that are printed on A3. I know that sounds really silly, but I would print this on A3, and I think that helps to engage students if they're not used to having activities given them from A3. And some of them will get a huge amount of satisfaction by filling in loads and loads of spaces on the grid. Some students will be horrified and overwhelmed by a large amount of questions, so you really have to know your class to know whether this is appropriate. Something else from Access Maths, a really nice idea, is this resource where in the middle we have a fairly tricky GCSE question that you need lots of prior knowledge for, and then around the outside the various skills that we need in order to answer the question. So the idea is that the students do the stuff around the outside first. So can they work out the circumference of the circles? Can they convert centimetres to metres? Do they know how to work out perimeters of semicircles? Do they know how to work out perimeters of compound shapes? And do they understand this idea of revolutions and how many times you'd have to run round something, or a wheel would have to turn to go a certain distance? And once they've done all that, then they can answer that more complex question in the middle that draws on all those skills. I think that's a really nice idea to sort of break down the individual skills and then bring them all together in one question. And this is another example from Mr. Chadburn's blog. This is Hannah's Sweets, which was the classic GCSE question a few years ago that got a lot of social media response because it was perceived to be very difficult, even though it had been a similar one had been seen before and it wasn't really a big deal. This was a probability and algebra question, which are now fairly common. And he's broken it down in the same way that Access Maths had broken it down. So he said, right, we need to understand conditional probability, we need to understand how to form expressions, we need to know how to solve quadratics, and we need to know how to solve equations that involve fractions, algebraic fractions. So he says they're the skills, we'll practice those first, and then once we can do all that, we're going to try and answer that big, trickier GCSE question that brings all that together. I think that's a really nice resource for consolidating a whole load of skills and revising. On JustMaths, there are questions by topic. Mel, who writes JustMaths, pulled all these together when the new GCSE specifications were first, when all the materials were first published by the exam boards. And there's some really, really lovely questions, and there's actually some pretty challenging questions, because the original assessment materials, the sample assessment materials published by the exam boards, turned out to be quite a lot harder than the actual exams ended up being. So we were in a massive panic, thinking that the exams were going to be ridiculously hard. But what happened though is we ended up with a load of really lovely, challenging questions that we can now use to stretch our students. So these are all pulled together on JustMaths. I find these really helpful for finding interesting questions to go through with my classes. Here's one of my favourite examples. This is very much for students working at the top end, so working at a grade 8 or 9. This question requires knowledge of quadratics, surds, trigonometry, it's the cosine rule, and half a b sine c. And because it's a non-calculator question, it requires exact trig values. They're told the area of the triangle and they have to work out a length. There is so much going on in this question. I mean, it's 8 marks. Now this never appeared on a real GCSE, but in terms of consolidating lots and lots of different skills, this is a great question for some of your brightest students to really get stuck into. It will take them a little while, it will check that they can do all these various things, and to me this is a lovely, really enjoyable question to do. Obviously not suitable for all students, but certainly an example of the really great questions that were developed in that first set of sample assessment materials. MathsBox is another great source of revision materials, and if you don't subscribe to MathsBox, there are a few that are available for free. This one, for example, Big Mistake, is this particular one is suitable for higher tier students, and it pulls out algebra misconceptions. I always use this. This is one of my standard revision resources. I normally use it in the week before exams. It's one of my kind of very last minute ones. It's really engaging and it pulls together lots of ideas. There's a whole set of examples of questions that have been done where mistakes have been made, and you ask students to figure out what the mistakes are. So you can see in that first question the coefficient should be a 6, and students will say, look, they should have multiplied those, and the index with a z should be an 8, so it should be z to the power of 8, and they've forgotten to add those 4s. So there's 2 things there that students can circle the mistakes, and they can say they've got this wrong, and if the students don't notice the mistakes, then you're putting out their misconceptions and you're able to discuss those with them, and hopefully eliminate those ahead of the exams. So I really like activities like this. They are definitely worth doing. Basically any spot the mistake activity is a great way of consolidating knowledge. Revision clocks were really popular maybe about 5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, so popular that students actually got a bit sick of them because they were doing them in every subject. The idea originally was that you had a A3 piece of paper split into 12 sections, and that meant that in a 1 hour lesson, if you spent 5 minutes on 12 questions, then that would be the whole, you'd fill in the whole clock in the 1 hour lesson. And it was meant to be kind of engaging and motivational, in that students would really take a lot of satisfaction from filling in the whole clock, but it would also help them understand their timekeeping. Because if it got to the stage where they were halfway through the lesson, they only filled in the first couple of sections, then that would suggest that they weren't keeping to time very well, because these were meant to be 5 minutes per section, and that would suggest that they needed to do something about their timekeeping. Now, this didn't work quite so well for Maths GCSE, because the questions tend not to be 5-mark questions. They tend not to take 5 minutes. It works better for Maths A level, but it was very popular for a while, and there are loads of resources available to download that you can use if you want to do revision clocks with your class. In the picture, the picture where there's someone eating a donut, that was an A-level revision lesson, and that was using one of my revision clock resources. But the other picture there is a GCSE lesson, and you can see that you can understand why a student might really enjoy filling it in that kind of format. They've used lots of different colours, and they've put all their workings into each different section, which is a different topic in each one. So like I say, really, really popular a few years ago, and still very useful resources now. You can download lots of them if you go via my blog. I had a whole page of revision clocks, links to revision clocks that you can use. These ones, which were produced by Emma Bell, are 4-mark questions. You know, you don't necessarily get a whole 60-minute lesson to do these activities, so that worked really well. And these ones, the question was actually written on the sheet, so you didn't just print a blank sheet on A3, you actually printed the questions on the sheet, so students could just had one thing to work on rather than the questions separate to the answers. Revision mats are things that I really like using. This is one of my most commonly used revision resources, and I made loads of these in 2019, where I was working with a number of Year 11 classes that year, and I was working with classes from kind of students who really struggled, so students who were working at a grade 1 or 2, right up to students that were working at a grade 8 or 9. So I was kind of working with students at all different levels, and I found it really hard to find resources suitable for all those levels. So if you think about if there's higher resources and foundation resources, quite often you find the higher resources are only suitable for top end higher, or perhaps they're only suitable for middle of higher. Or you might find foundation resources aren't suitable for your students working at a grade 1 or 2, but you need those students doing some practice. You can't just give them stuff that's too hard for them all the time when you come to revision. So I made resources that have 4 levels of difficulty. So there's foundation, foundation plus, higher and higher plus. And the idea is that your foundation is suitable for students working at a grade 1 or 2, whereas your just foundation ones suitable for grades say 3 or 4, higher suitable for maybe grades 4, 5 and 6, and then your higher plus for the top grades. And by differentiating those resources a bit more than just saying higher foundation, I found that they were more suitable for the classes I was working with. So there are 3 sets of these, and you can find them by going to TES and going to Mrs. Morgan 1. That's my username on TES, and you can print them. These can actually be printed on A4, they don't need to be on A3, although they can be, and students write directly on the sheet, and hopefully you'll find these a really useful set of resources for that sort of consolidation and mixed revision period. I have a whole page on my blog of revision resources like this, so do visit that if you are looking for stuff to do with your students. Like I said, it's mostly the mixed consolidation stuff, it's not so much the stuff for the topic specific lessons, but there is a whole load of stuff that you can use. There's certainly absolutely no shortage of revision resources for GCSE. In fact, we are very lucky because I think we have more resources than most other subjects. Like, we will never, I think as a teacher, I will never struggle to find stuff to do with my students in the run up to their exams. There is so much to choose from. So we talked about the post-spec lessons. I will spend a bit less time talking about the next 3 sections, but I do want to mention them because they are part of the things we have to think about as Year 11 teachers. So first of all, let's talk about interventions. Interventions are really controversial. They're things that make people really unhappy, normally involve a lot of time outside of the classroom, and are things that we'd rather not have to do. There's this idea of, can we preempt issues and not have to do any intervention, or are we reacting to things in Year 11, which is more often the case, but with good reason. So let's think about this sort of ideal situation where we're preempting everything. So that's where we start from Year 7 and we say right from the beginning of Year 7, who are the students who need a bit of extra attention, who are the students that have come in who are not secondary ready, and what are we going to do with them straight away, and how are we going to stop them from falling behind in Year 7. If they're busy catching up on their arithmetic, for example, how are we going to make sure they don't fall behind behind on, say, the algebra. So there's that's the big challenge, is how do we get this right from the beginning of primary, beginning of secondary, and of course in primary as well, and how do we not deal with it all in year 11 and deal with it at a younger age, because we know that that's the ideal situation. The ideal intervention should be based on identified gaps. So for example, if someone is struggling with algebra and we know that in year 9, then we want them to attend algebra intervention in year 9. So that's the ideal, not these general interventions where a whole group of students just get put into one room and they just get given these generic lessons. But in an ideal world, if we had the resources, the time, the teachers, then we would find exactly what these students can't do and we would work on that particular thing with them. Ideally, there would be voluntary offerings. So, for example, breakfast revision before exams, which I'll talk to you about later, should be voluntary. So if students want it, it's there for them. Revision opportunities during May half term should be voluntary. It's there if they want it. So we're showing our students we're supporting them, we're there for them if they need us, but it's voluntary because it's their exam, it's their life, and it's up to them whether they attend. Obviously, this is all ideal world stuff, and we know that a lot of it doesn't work like this in practice. Ideal interventions should be habit forming. I'll talk to you in a minute about paper society, but the idea is if you get students as early as possible in their education forming good habits of revision and exam preparation, then we shouldn't need to do these really big interventions at the last minute, because they'll be doing all the right things all the way along the course. Ideally, we'd be doing interventions perhaps in form time or in some other period of the day where we're not taking away students' own time. We know that it's not nice to take students away from their time where they should be relaxing or they should be seeing their friends, and ideally we would find opportunities within the school day where we can work with them on their maths to help them get the best grade possible. Now, that's not necessarily form time, because there are important things that happen in form time, but that is one possible opportunity. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, the sort of not ideal situation would be that all intervention happens after year 11 mocks. Not ideal, obviously. We should have started things way earlier. We shouldn't leave it till after year 11 mocks to realise that someone is perhaps not going to pass and needs all sorts of extra stuff crammed in a space of a few months. Intervention that's not ideal is based on target grade and is one size fits all. So for example, this child is targeting a 7, therefore they shouldn't be doing foundation even though they're currently working at a grade 3. So we force them onto higher because they're targeting a 7. That is problematic in itself. And then we put them into some kind of intervention for people who are targeting a grade 7, and that intervention is not suitable for that student. So that is not ideal. Ideally, we would identify the exact things that students can't do and help them get better at those things, rather than generic interventions. Reactive interventions that are not ideal might be timetabled in students' own time, or perhaps taking them out of PE, or perhaps done very early in the morning or after school, and students start seeing it as a punishment. So students will say, oh, I have to get up early and go to school because I'm rubbish at maths, and then they'll feel really bad about it. So that is not an ideal situation. We should bear in mind that it's exhausting, and it makes the school day longer. If we're doing an intervention after school, then our students are exhausted and will become resentful of it. I know students who are in interventions every single day after school in the run-up to their GCSEs, and they're not learning anything because they are so tired. So we need to be really mindful of what we're doing there. And then finally, there's this carrot versus stick. How are we going to make students come to intervention? Are we going to punish them for not coming? Are we going to motivate them to come in other ways? So there's all these ideas. Now, I don't have the solutions here. I don't have the answers. I've worked in schools that have done interventions in lots of different ways. And we are constrained by all sorts of things. And what we must be very careful of is kind of teacher blaming here, or claiming, oh, if you did quality first teaching the whole time, then you wouldn't have to do intervention, so it's all your fault. Don't be put off by that sort of thing, because that's very frustrating. I've been told there should be no need for intervention if teaching and behaviour has been good for the last 5 years. The point is that as they leave primary, there's like, what, a 7-year gap in the what our students can do in terms of their math. So we have this enormous gap where some are just massively behind when they start secondary, and we're always playing catch up there. Also, bear in mind that we don't teach these students for 5 years in a row. It's very unlikely that any teacher has had their class for 5 years in a row. So if anyone's saying to you, well, if you taught well for the last 5 years, you wouldn't need an intervention. I mean, we don't get them for 5 years. Quite often we take on our classes at the beginning of year 11 and they have gaps all over the place, and we need to figure out how to help those students, because otherwise they might not do as well in their GCSE as they could do. So I think it's important we support our students. We don't want to exhaust anyone, we don't want to put lots of pressure on anyone, but we need to make sure that they know that we're there to support them, and we will help them to plug those gaps that may have formed a long time ago. You know, some of these students might have had years of supply teaching and all sort of changes of teachers all the time, and really disrupted educations. And so to say, oh, if you taught them well, you wouldn't need intervention, is really very frustrating given the climate for maths education in this country. Interventions, unfortunately, are necessary in some schools, and we need to figure out the best way of running them. One thing that I have done in the past, now I did this for a borderline class, so this was back on the old GCSE, and they were all working at kind of a grade C when I took over the class, and also I've done this for a top set on the new GCSE, and I set it up at the beginning of the year. It was called Paper Society. I wanted it to sound a little bit kind of whimsical and a bit unusual. I said, right from the beginning of the year, you can come along Mondays after school. It's totally optional. I am not forcing people to do an extra long day every Monday. It's optional. You come along, and I would have printed some maths papers, and you can start doing them from the beginning of the year, once a week. And I told them that doing that would increase their grade, and I told them all these stats on how much this weekly paper would make a difference to their grade. My students massively bought into it. They bought into it because they were absolutely convinced that if they did a paper every week for the whole of year 11, that they would get a grade 9, and many of them did. And I sold it by offering them biscuits. So I said that it would be really informal. I said I would be in the room to help them, but basically I just wanted them working through papers. I would print them, so they didn't have to print their own papers. And the idea is that they'd do one paper a week from the whole start of year 11, so by the time their exams came, they would have done loads of papers. I said it was very relaxed. I knew there wouldn't be much work for me. I just had to print some papers every week. And it was habit forming. So it got them into the habit of doing maths practice papers. And I mean, I think the main selling point was the biscuits, but still, it got them doing the practice, and that was the important thing. For the intervention sessions themselves, so if you pull together an intervention group and you say, right, these 15 students, they really need some extra help, perhaps they're not going to pass their GCSE, perhaps they're going to be way off their target grade, and you think, right, this is my intervention group. Now, whether you spend the time doing exam papers or you spend the time teaching topics depends on lots of things. It depends on what kind of school you're in, what teachers are available, what the mock analysis said, what time of year it is, how many exam papers they're doing at home and in class, all sorts of questions. I think ideally that those interventions will be mini lessons of key topics like I talked about earlier, leading into some exam practice where they do, for example, modified papers, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I think it's really important that if you have an intervention group, that you do start off with taught elements, and then closer to the exams, that becomes a lot more exam practice. But to me, those taught elements are the most important parts, where you are going through common problem topics. Now, I mentioned modified papers. This is something I did for the first time last year. This is now, I think Edexcel does provide some shadow papers. We did this for AQA last year. And the idea is that in your first intervention, so say you have maybe 45 minutes after school with a group of students who, let's say, for example, they are they're worried they're not going to pass, maybe they're working at a grade 3 or something, then you could give them, say, the first 12 questions from a paper 1. And they work through them, and then you go through them, and they correct them, spend some time understanding what the questions meant. And then in the next week's intervention, You've given them that same first 12 questions again, but you've just changed the numbers. Now, if they really paid attention and they really listened when you went through it the first time, then they should be getting all of those right, because it's exactly the same questions, just with different numbers. So obviously this is a big if. If they listened, and if when you went through it, they were really engaged in that and they really were following that, then you should see a big improvement. The next intervention, you do the middle of that paper. Okay, in the middle of that paper will obviously be a harder set of questions, and then you do the same thing again. You go through it, and then the next week you give them the modified numbers papers. Now, the other thing you can do is give them the end of paper for extension, but the idea is that these are students who are struggling to get whatever grade, and that means that probably it's the start and the middle of the paper that you need to focus on the most. You could then start again with paper 2, first 12 questions paper 2, and then the first 12 questions are different numbers, and then the middle of paper 2, and then the middle of paper 2 are different numbers. So that is how a modified paper intervention works. Again, I really believe in taught interventions where you go through particular topics, just like my structured revision lessons, but I do think that there is some benefit to be gained from exam question practice and then trying to do the same thing again with different numbers from a retrieval point of view. So that's interventions. I don't have the answer for what a perfect intervention looks like, but like I say, don't be upset if you have to run interventions. There are some cases where it's totally out of our control, but do think very carefully about the best way of running them, how those groupings should look, and what the content of the intervention should be. Now I'm going to talk to you briefly about independent work. So what should our students be doing themselves? Independent work is something that we mustn't forget exists, because quite often as teachers we end up putting the whole responsibility on ourselves, and we forget that this is their GCSE, it's their results, it's their life, and we need our students to be doing way more work than we are, and it's so easy to forget that and end up doing so much for our students. So I guess it's a question of what they should be doing at home. Remember, they have lots of subjects that they're revising for, and we can't expect them to do so much maths they have no time for anything else. I would expect them to memorise all the facts and formulae they need for the GCSE, and I'll talk about how I expect them to do that. I do expect them to practice exam papers themselves at home, and they might do that online using a website like onmaths.com, where they can practice them and type in the answers and it checks whether they're correct, or perhaps they might buy themselves a pack of practice exam papers and work through them at home, but I would expect them to do some of that at home. I shouldn't be the only person providing them with exam papers. Some of the onus is on them to do that. I also expect them to practice specific topics that they have been struggling with. So they might use, for example, if a school has Genie Maths, then they could be using that, and they might say, I know I'm not very good at trigonometry, so I'm going to practice that by watching the videos and by doing the tasks on Genie Maths. So that's, again, the taking responsibility for fixing the things that they know they're not very good at. Now I'm going to show you a couple of exam questions, and I hope you notice something that's a little bit worrying about what our students can and can't do. So here is a question from a foundation question from 2018 from Edexcel, and this is just unit conversions. It's very, very straightforward. There's no kind of application of knowledge. It's pretty standard using conversions. In the examiner feedback, question part C suggested that students didn't know there were 1,000 grams in a kilogram. And the frustrating thing about this is if you look at the previous Edexcel paper, so this is going back to 2017, so the November, so this was the last GCSE paper that happened before this one, the feedback was identical. We have a very similar question, and the feedback said that a lot of students thought there were 100 grams in a kilogram. Now, teachers would have read this feedback and they would know this is a common issue, and they would have said to their students, make sure you know how many grams are in a kilogram, because people got that wrong in the November assessment. And this is why it's so important for teachers to read examiner feedback, because then we know that this is a common problem and we can tell our students to fix it. So any teacher who'd read that examiner feedback in November would have said to this next cohort, make sure you know there's 1,000 grams in a kilogram, and then they still got it wrong. Our students are not memorising facts and formulae, which is really the very basics. It's the most straightforward thing we can ask them to do. There are loads of techniques they can use to memorise facts and formulae, and they're not doing it. And really this, I think, partly comes from the fact that they get so much support in class at school. They get all these exam papers they go through, and they get all these revision lessons, and their teachers maybe aren't saying enough, but actually there's something I can't do for you, which is to learn the facts, and they really need to get this done. Interestingly, for maths, I reckon there are only about 150 facts and formulae that students need to learn. If you take out the times tables and if you the multiplication facts, which we do want students to know, I do want them to know what 7/8 are and things like that. So that does count as a fact. But if you take out those, but look at the rest of the things we want our students to learn, so the formulae, the unit conversions, the things that they just need to know, there's about 150, which is really nothing compared to some other subjects. In each of the 3 sciences, there are around 400 facts and formulae that students need to know. Maths is much more about application, about problem solving. So there's not a huge amount of sort of core body of knowledge that we need students to memorise, and there's much more in other subjects. So this shouldn't be a huge ask in maths. Students need to know that this is something they need to prioritise. I have published a whole load of knowledge quiz books which are exactly designed for this. The knowledge quiz books are basically a whole load of tests that are repeated. So the idea is that a student fills in the answers, checks they got them right, and then tries to do the same quiz maybe a week later to see if they can still get them right, and that they should be doing that same quiz again and again and again until they're getting all 10 questions right every time. You can see what the quizzes look like in the example on the screen, and they are just, there's a foundation one and a higher one, and they are just testing facts and helping students to learn them. So students say, I don't know how to learn my facts. They could get one of these books and they could say, well, I'm going to just test myself again and again and again until I know all the 150 facts that I need to know. Okay, I would probably, if you buy a class set of these books, I might start by using them in class, maybe as starters. So I might say to everyone, get your knowledge books out. They've got their own version of the knowledge book. Right, everyone, we're doing test number 7 today. They fill it in, we mark it, and then we might do test number 7 a week later or at some point in the future to check that they remember, and we'll keep doing it till they're all getting test number 7 right every time. I might do that and then say, right, we've done half the tests in the book. We've done a few of each of the different tests, and you've still got some blanks in there. And then in that last period before your exams, you're going to take that book home and you're going to test yourself and just make sure that that knowledge is still there in your head. So I might build the habits of using this book at school and then tell the students to take those books home and use them in the run up to their exams to make sure they know all the facts. And anything that they're regularly getting wrong, perhaps they could make themselves a separate little quiz. Here are the things that I know that I get wrong every time and that I need to make sure that I have got in time for the exam. The knowledge quiz books look like this, and they're available in other subjects as well. There's quite a large range of them, but they are higher and foundation. They're only a £5 if you buy them in bulk, so you could buy one for each student, use them in class, transition into using them at home, and the idea is that by repeated use, the students should eventually remember all those basics. This is not what mathematics is, but they can't do the maths without the basics. There are also formula quizzes that you might find helpful. These are available for free to download and to print out. Quizzes that just test all the formulae they need to know in one place. Just be careful because there are a few posters going around or a few formula sheets, like sometimes, for example, in planners and things like that, that are a bit outdated and were written for the new GCSE and not updated when it changed. So, for example, students don't need to know SUVAT. And they don't need to know the addition rule for probability. So if you see formula sheets that tell them they need to learn those things, then they are wrong. Okay, you need to be making sure that you're giving your students the correct set of formulae that they need to learn. Okay, but there are plenty of things available online you can download to help them to check whether they know their formulae and then to make sure they revise them. I remember I had a top set one year. Loads of them, they did really well. They were all working at grades 8 and 9. And I thought they were really strong, and I gave them this formula quiz about 2 weeks before their exam, and I was shocked by how many of them didn't know some of the formulae, didn't know the sine rule, didn't know the cosine rule, all sorts of things they didn't know, which was quite worrying given that it was so close to their exam and they were such a high achieving class. They really should know those absolute basic facts at that point. There is an app key cards, which is a really nice version of those other things I talked about. So for example, my knowledge quiz books, which help students to self-test. This is an app which also helps them to self-test. It's not free, but it's not expensive, cheaper than most revision books. They can download that onto their phone and they can quiz themselves. It's really smart the way it works. It will ask them questions more regularly on things that they're not getting right, and it's a really nice app for learning some of the formulae. I wouldn't overload students with guidance on how to revise in maths. I would give them maybe a printout with some key points and a quick lesson on what they could be doing. I probably would do this in year 7, 8, 9, 10, not just in year 11. Here's an example of one that I've used in the past. So I've told them they should be using flashcards or a notepad to make notes. I've told them that they might, for example, want to buy a revision guide just to help them make sure they've covered everything. So they might buy a revision guide and then make their own notes. And the revision guide is just helping to make sure that they've actually covered all the topics and all the key facts. So rather than them just sit and read their revision guide, which is a big waste of time, but they might find it useful as just like a way of checking that they've covered everything in their own notes. I've said, second point there, repeatedly test knowledge. Like self-quizzing or getting a parent or friend to quiz them. They could use revision cards for that, or they could use my books or some other way of testing themselves. Practicing exam questions to identify topics that they need to focus on. If you get stuck, then you can ask your teacher for help, or you can go to Corbett Maths or Maths or whatever to find out about that topic. So it's about using papers to identify problems and then fixing that by watching videos or by asking teachers. And then I finally say that you could use a revision workbook or a website to practice the topics that they need to improve. So for example, if they found that they're getting all the trigonometry questions wrong, then they might want to go on Maths Genie and get those trigonometry questions, or use a revision workbook to get a set of questions on the topics they found hard. So that's it's not much, it's 5 steps on sorts of things you can be doing to revise in maths, because they'll get different advice on different subjects. So I do think students need some guidance. This is an extract from a 1-page revision sheet that I've given to students at year 11 parents even before. There's not a huge amount on it. There's the flow chart and there's a list of a few recommended websites, which could be whatever your school tends to use. And then finally, a little section on resources that students can buy, because parents particularly will quite often want some guidance on what they can buy their their children, because there's quite a range, because you get workbooks which have questions in, which I prefer to revision guides, which tell you how to do it, where students just tend to kind of read that and they're not active. There are grade 9 books, which have just got a load of hard questions in. There are revision cards, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. There are packs of practice exam questions. Maths in a week, which really annoys me, as if you can learn maths in a week. We've just spent years and years teaching it. And there's all these different things that you can that students can get. So I would perhaps choose a few that I want to recommend to parents and tell them which ones are suitable to buy their children. Of course, in some schools it will be totally inappropriate to do that. Schools with high pupil premium, it might be that the school buys these things for the students. I think there may be benefit in providing students with a folder of printed practice papers. I'm always reminded of this "if you book them, they will come" from Wayne's World, and I always think if you print them, students are more likely to do them. If you print them, they will do them. If you don't print them, I don't think they'll print them themselves. I mean, some will, but I think if you actually hand students a printed paper, I do think it's more likely they'll actually go off and do that paper than if you send them a link to one. I might be wrong. At my previous school, they used to hand every student a ring binder full of resources for every subject. And in some subjects they gave them revision notes, knowledge organisers. In maths we put in practice papers, because we thought that practice papers were probably the most helpful thing to put in to that folder, because we thought that if I can have a central budget to print those, then that's what I want printed for my students. I would like them to have some paper printed practice papers at home. Revision cards, now you can get these from the MA, you can get them from Corbett Maths, you can get them from Pearson, pre-made revision cards. They may have some benefits, particularly students testing each other or asking parents to test them, for example. I actually think there may be more benefit in students making their own revision cards, because the act of writing the cards is revision in itself. I would normally do a session with my students on how to make revision cards. I've done this with my year 7s and my year 8s this year, so I don't think this has to wait till year 11. I think it's helpful for any year group to get some experience of how to revise, and they don't really know what's meant to go on a revision card, so you might want to show them an example. They take all different forms these days. When I was at school, they were just the index cards, but now you can get these little packs that are joined together. Some of them might be suitable, some may not. You might want to show them examples of revision cards. These are sort of pretty revision cards that I found on Pinterest, but you could show them some actual revision cards that you've made. You could hand them around and say, look, this is what revision cards could look like, just to give you an idea, because if you just say make revision cards, they just don't know what you mean unless you actually model it. Here's an example of one revision card made by my colleagues. Again, this was my colleague wanted to model to year 11s what she meant when she said make revision cards. And here she had a question on the front: what's a factor, what's a multiple, what's a prime? She had the topic written at the top, and she said that, and at the bottom she had a few examples of the sorts of questions that might come up on this particular topic. Now, the idea is, if all her cards look like this, the topic, the question, a clear question about the topic, and some understanding checks, then anyone could take this card and quiz you on it. So anyone could ask you those questions, or you could quiz yourself and then turn it over, and there's the answers, hole punched in order to use, say, a treasury tag to bind them together. So that's what you might want to show your students, but certainly some modelling and guidance is helpful rather than just say revision cards are a good idea. But I would say don't force any revision techniques on anyone, each to their own. I'd say model approaches, because some students will struggle to get started. I've always had students who've come to me and said, I don't know how to revise maths. This could be a few weeks before their final exam. They've come to me and said, I just don't know what to do for maths. So I do think it's important to model things and to give students some guidance, but everyone revises differently. When I was at university, I had notebooks, and I wrote up the entire course in a notebook, and then wrote it narrowed it down eventually to one sheet of A4, which had everything for my entire course on it. And it was that process of writing the notes that was my revision. It was the note taking, it was the summarising that was the revision for me. Everyone's different, and revision cards will work for some, not for others. Workbooks will work for some and not for others. But certainly, just giving some students some ideas is a good place to start. Right, I've talked about independent work that students should be doing. I also want to finish by talking about May and June, basically the weeks that the exams are actually in and what we can do in those final lessons. Mel from JustMaths a few years ago made some excellent slides called Preparing for Your Maths Exam. I always show my students these, maybe in the last lesson or maybe a couple of lessons before. I have had students go into a bit of a panic if I've shown them too late, because they realise that maybe they didn't know something. So there's one slide, for example, that talks about how you're not meant to write answers, say, below the line that says don't write down here. And I remember I had a student who came up to me and said, oh, but I did an exam the other day and I wrote below the line. And I realised that perhaps I should have shown these slides maybe a week or so earlier, so as not to panic anyone. They're a really good set of slides. They talk about equipment that students need to take, how they obviously need to show their workings in the exams, and there's all sorts of examples and things to amuse them in these slides. So I really recommend those. I always talk to my students, perhaps not in the last lesson because it's too late then, but a little bit earlier, maybe a few months before their exams, about how they're going to feel when they get their exam results. In fact, this might be something for the beginning of year 11. I might show examples of people opening their results, because quite often these year 11s won't have really thought about this at the beginning of year 11. They won't necessarily have any idea in their head of what results day will look like, and what a big deal it will be for them. So I often show them pictures like this to say, how exciting it is on results day, and how it's going to feel when they open those envelopes. My favourite quote to have on my classroom wall is this one: "You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending." So students need to know that even if they haven't done very well, maybe if their behaviour's been bad, or maybe if they haven't focused, or they haven't done enough practice up to a certain point, you can say to them, look, we can fix this if we start today. And I think something that's really important is, if you think they've left it too late, if they haven't done any work for the whole of year 11 and it's now May, and you think, well, there's nothing they can do about it now, obviously don't tell them that. You need to always make sure they know that there is still hope for them. They still might pass, they still might they still have time to do some work, and obviously we never will tell our students, actually you should have been working for the last 5 years and you've left it too late. We need to make sure that we believe, that they know we do believe in them, and anything they do can make a difference. A few years ago I taught a student who, his behaviour was bad, to the point where he was moved out of his class at the Easter before his exams, and his teacher said they wouldn't have him in the class anymore. He was working at, say, a grade 3, and they put him into my top set year 11 class, where they thought that he would maybe get some maths done, but at least not be particularly disruptive, because my class were working very hard and wouldn't be distracted by him. It was a really weird situation, and it was almost like they'd written him off, and they were saying, he's just causing problems for everyone else and he's not going to pass anyway, so we'll move him into a different classroom. And actually what happened was he passed in the end. He got a grade 4, it wasn't anything I did with him, but I think perhaps he did a tiny bit of work in those last few weeks and just managed to turn it around. So it just goes to show that a student can leave it really late, and then still it might work out all right. But obviously that is not something we'd ever want to encourage. We want a continued good work ethic from the beginning of year 7 right through to the end of year 11, in an ideal world. But we will never tell a student they've left it too late. There's always time for them to turn it around and start trying. On the day of the exam, now some people are really anti-breakfast revision, but I'm a big fan of it. In my first school, it was a grammar school, and we did nothing during the exam period. Our students would go off on study leave, they'd come in for their exams, and we wouldn't even see them. They'd come in and take their maths exam and then go, and if we might bump into them on the corridor on their way out and ask them how it went, but that was about it. Then I moved to a comprehensive, and I was told that the students would be coming in for breakfast revision before the exam. Now that was fine with me and I was ready for them, but then when they arrived I realised I wasn't really ready for them, because we didn't have, in the department, we didn't have any kind of idea of resources or how to best fill that time. And some of my colleagues had gave out past papers, and I thought that doesn't seem right, just before they take their actual maths exam, to give them a old paper. Just didn't seem really like the right thing to do. So the next year I thought, I actually want a resource ready for this. I want a short, snappy, accessible resource that will not stress them out, that will remind them of a few key things and just be a way of using that time well. Obviously breakfast revision is optional, no student has to come in for it before their exam, but they do get some food and they quite like to come in and see their maths teacher just before they go off and do their maths exam. So I created some resources for this. I've now got a set of 3 sets of breakfast resources, so one for each of the 3 papers. There are 2 levels, foundation or higher, and they are ready to use and download from TES, and were really well received when I first wrote these a couple of years ago, and are something that I've now used every year since. So I would say if your school does run breakfast revision, then this would be a sensible resource to use. Like I say, it's not overwhelming for students. It's a revision mat, so it's not like a set of questions labelled 1 onwards. They can start anywhere they want, they can skip things, they can do the ones they feel comfortable with, they can ask for help from their teacher on anything they're not sure about. But the idea is it gives them a bit of a warm up, gets their brain going before they go into their exam. Just to show you this, how some schools use these breakfast sessions. This school does it in the canteen, so they have all of year 11 turning out. They've got 60 students, optional, they can come, they get food, they come in at this school for an hour and 10 minutes for the exam, and they sit and work on those revision resources, those breakfast mats that I've provided. This was the same school, and again you can see so many students there, fairly chilled but working, getting ready, about to go into that assessment. Maths teachers circulating in the canteen, really nice setup there. This was another teacher had tweeted this, saying that they were doing it in the library. They had the foundation and the higher printed out in different colours, and students could come in, pick up one of those and have a go in the run up to their exam that morning. Like I say, they should be pressure free. They should not be stressful for students, but having a resource available was way better than previously when I ran breakfast revision without a resource available. Another final example, you can see all the breakfast laid out. This is obviously in a classroom, and the students are going to come in, they're going to choose their breakfast, and they're going to sit down and just do a little bit of maths before their exam starts. On the day of the exam itself, there's a few things we might want to talk to students about, or things we might want to remember to do. So one is that we might want to just check their equipment if it's a calculator exam. If they have any funny modes, if you do shift 9, it clears all modes, and students should know that from year 7, but we need to make sure that we have done that. Some teachers tell their students to sit down straight away and write down all their formulae on the paper, or any formulae that they're struggling with, so anything particularly big like the quadratic formula or the cosine rule. As soon as they sit down, as soon as the examiner says you may start, they are getting them to, the teachers are encouraging the student to write down the formulae to get them out their head. I don't know about that, it's not something I do. I don't know whether there are cognitive benefits of unloading that stuff up front. Perhaps there are, but it's something to consider, because some teachers do that and have always done it and swear by it. The other thing I'd say on the day, if you are ahead of maths, you might want to just pop into the exams office, or however it works in your school, and just check that the tracing paper and the graph paper is ready for that maths exam. The first time I was head of maths on the day of GCSE maths paper 1, I popped into the exam office and just said, are we all set? Have you got the tracing paper in the room? Because we all know that if there's a question on rotation, they may put their hand up and ask for tracing paper. And they said nope, they hadn't even thought of that. And then I spent the next half an hour running around the department trying to find enough tracing paper, and then guillotining it and then giving it to the exams office, and meanwhile my own class were waiting for me to do their breakfast revision with them. So I learnt my lesson and knew that that's something I should have checked on earlier, and I should have made sure that the equipment was ready in advance and not on the morning of the exam. Between the exams, a lot of teachers very helpfully write what we call best guess papers and checklists. So they'll say, we looked at what's come up on paper 1, and based on that, this is what's left, which hasn't been examined yet. These are the topics that haven't come up yet, and we think it's likely they'll be on paper 2. And they come up with checklists and example papers of what we think the next paper might look like. JustMaths does them, Corbett Maths does them, and if you go to Adam Crean's blog, then every year he does a post that lists everything available there. So you can find plenty that you can give to your students, or you could send home to your students if you're not seeing them anymore. If you do decide to do revision in the May half term, so that's between paper 1 and paper 2, there's a few things to consider. First of all, are other subjects doing this? There's been times I've gone into school during May half term to run revision, and half of my students haven't come because they've been next door doing science revision. So you just need to know what other subjects are doing. Ideally, it should be centrally coordinated across the school. Do you have the staffing? Are you going to pay your staff to come in over May half term? Do your staff want to come in over May half term? I certainly don't think schools should be forcing staff to come in during half term. Some teachers will want to support their classes. Some schools will offer extra pay to do that. It's a good idea to provide a new resource at that point, something that students haven't seen before, and I'd say a best guess paper like I just talked about is a good idea. So one of these papers that have been made specifically following the first paper of things that are likely to be on the second paper. I would have snacks. I would let students come in their own clothes. I'd give them breaks. So perhaps it might be a 3-hour session where they do the best guest paper and a few other things, perhaps a revision mat or something like that as well. You could even let them listen to music. Some students find that helpful. That's up to, some schools will not like that. If they have their phones to listen to music, often they're distracted by that. So it's not necessarily a good idea, but certainly being quite relaxed about it, because it's May half term. They've finished school almost, and you need to make sure they feel supported and not pressured at that time. It should certainly be optional. I don't like the idea of people being forced to come in for revision in May half term. They have a lot going on, they have a lot of exams coming up, and at that point they are old enough to be making their own decisions about what they do in preparation for these exams. But also I think it should be open to all. I think it's a shame when things are only open to people who are working at certain grades or have certain targets. I think some students might be doing fine. Perhaps they are working at their target grade and aren't picked for interventions, but they know that they don't have an environment at home where they can work very well. Perhaps they have a lot of siblings, perhaps they're distracted easily, and they know that if there was an opportunity to come in and do some maths at school, they will take it. So I think it is great when half-term revision opportunities are available to all, but optional. So that's it for my presentation, really. I mean, I've talked to you about everything there is to know about getting Year 11s ready for their exams. We talked about how best to fill that time post specification. So once you finish teaching a scheme of work, what should your lessons look like? We've talked a bit about what interventions throughout Year 11 could look like. What independent work your students should be doing, and finally what you should be doing in those very last lessons right at the end, in between exams and just before exams. Final word on the fact that we do need to get the balance right here. We want our students to have the best opportunities in life. We know that good grades will give them opportunities, and we want to do our jobs well. However, we do have to keep things in perspective. I have talked a lot about preparing for exams and revising and the importance of all of that, but we do have to keep things in perspective. Please don't think that this is something I think is of such huge importance in life that it's more important than anything else. Of course not. There were many headlines when the new GCSEs came in because of the number of exams students take now about students having serious mental health problems. So we need to be very careful with the pressure we put on students, be very, very supportive, and just make sure they know that we are there to help them to get the best opportunities, and we will support them in any way that we can. And of course, once it's all over, we have the summer holidays to enjoy. So this seems like an awful lot of work. Being a Year 11 teacher is a huge responsibility. It's very rewarding. And as soon as it finishes, we have that lovely period where we can relax and get ready for the next cohort. Thank you very much for listening.